The polls are open. Today, Britain decides who will be Prime Minister for the next 5 years. And possibly by the time you listen to this podcast, the votes will have all been counted and we'll have a winner. What part has the mainstream media played in selecting the next Prime Minister?
Despite headlines such as Rishi warning, Starmer will wreck Britain in just 100 days from the Mail on Sunday, and Starmer to wreck Britain in 100 days from the Sunday Express, Labour's 20-point lead in the polls has scarcely budged. We're joined today by former editor of The Sun and presenter of When It Hits the Fan, David Yelland, to ask if the power of the tabloids in politics has faded irredeemably.
But first, we're together today in the flesh. Lionel, I don't think we've mentioned you. In front of you, there is a shiny object. Do you want to tell the listeners what this is?
Oh, well, it's an award. I see. Podcast of the Year, Media Confidential, Prospect Publishing. It's pink, nothing to do with the FT. But yes, we did get a media industry award for our podcast. So we can now talk about the award-winning podcast by Alan Rusbridger.
I believe it was from from what is known as the Oscars of the podcast world.
Yeah, that's lowercase o for anyone who's listening.
So excitement bubbles up. We're going to be talking about the election. What else have you been noticing this week?
Well, a story appeared in the New York Times today which really did catch my eye. Alan, you'll appreciate this. It's got 14 bylines, just 14 from all places, Kiev, Washington. Anyway, the headline is Biden's lapses are said to be increasingly common and worrisome. This is the fallout from the disastrous presidential debate and Joe Biden's performance on that night. And this is a very detailed report in the New York Times, written by the White House correspondents, the excellent Peter Baker in the lead. And it says people who've spent time with President Biden over the last few months or so said the lapses appear to have grown much more frequent, pronounced, and after Thursday's debate, more worrisome. And of course, we're seeing the fallout now with some moves in the Democratic Party to change the candidate. I think the interesting other point is that people are asking, well, why wasn't this report, written a year ago when it might have made a difference?
Very interesting comment in Semaphore by Jill Abramson, the former executive editor of the New York Times, used to partner with The Guardian occasionally, and she's written a scorching little editorial for Semaphore. She says it's clear that the best news reporters in Washington have failed in the first duty of journalism to hold power to account. It's our duty to poke through the White House smokescreens and find out the truth, but the Biden White House clearly succeeded in a massive cover-up of the degree of the president's feebleness and his serious physical decline, which may simply be the result of old age. Shame on the White House press corps for not piercing the veil of secrecy surrounding the president. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
I think it's always difficult because those reporters who are covering the White House, obviously the first time you write about any such developments about the president's health, you will get blanket denial. So you need to have first-hand evidence. Have you got access to the doctors? Well, there's privacy issues there. So it's not easy. The thing I would say is they should have been looking smartly outside Washington, checking with sources in Europe, people who'd met the president or been in his presence. And then I must say, I've been twice to Washington in the last 12 months. Both times I heard reports from people in reasonable position to know saying the president's health was deteriorating.
The New York Times podcaster and columnist Ezra Klein did an entire episode about Biden's health back in February. I'm sure you listened to it, Lionel, and he got comprehensively dumped on for doing so. And Jill Abramson says here, it's laughable and immoral for the Democrats to blame the press now for overreacting to the reality. And it's one of those things where the press is often the messenger, and the lone outriders who were obsessing about Biden's condition, for them to have been attacked at the time was clearly wrong.
Well, the Wall Street Journal wrote a long report about 6 weeks ago, which did quote unnamed sources at great length, looking at the president's health, raising lots and lots of questions. Similarly, they were dumped on both by politicians and indeed, again, I had this firsthand, other reporters saying, oh, well, this wasn't quite right, or this was off the record. The fact is, the Journal report, Ezra Klein, they were spot on.
The other thing that caught my eye today is Roger Mosey, a very distinguished former BBC executive, then went off to Cambridge, and he's done a piece for the New Statesman, really quite critical of the BBC's coverage of the election. He's talking about a woeful lack of in-depth analysis of issues. This is across the board. Hardly anything about the foreign affairs, Labour's attitude to a Trump presidency, their views on Europe or their stance on Israel. You can add to that list climate change, social care, the crisis in prisons, the justice system, all of which are of far more significance to the people of this country than a candidate placing a bet. Then he goes on to say the BBC has a particular responsibility here. Its charter requires it not to provide merely an average news service, but to just to do better than that. And that's quite strong words from a former BBC executive. I don't know whether you think that's fair, Lionel.
I think he makes some points about substance, trying to look at policy.
Which
but of course,
true more generally.
Yeah, but the fact is that the betting scandal, and it was a scandal, was a very good news story, and it told you something, not just about the individuals, but the level, of immorality and lack of judgment in the senior ranks of the Conservative Party.
And you have to say that there are one or two stand out. I mean, I think Michelle Hussein, Nick Robinson, they've had good elections. They've got stories out. They've delved in depth into some of the issues that Mosey describes there.
In previous general election campaigns, the media has played an important role. Securing the support of the dailies was seen as a vital part of winning the election. But this time round, there have been headlines and commentary bordering on hysterical scaremongering. And so, has the Conservative press gone too far? Is Adrian Wooldridge, the distinguished commentator on Bloomberg, right when he says that the Conservative press has degenerated into burbling irrelevance?
We've had blood-curdling headlines in the Telegraph warning that Starmer's plan will bankrupt Britain. Sunak as our only hope. Even the Murdoch press has been quieter than usual, which leads to the speculation that Rupert's empire has lost its influence.
So what's happening? Has tabloid power been exaggerated? Do newspaper endorsements matter? According to YouGov, young Britons are far more likely to get their news from digital sources, especially social media, with 72% of 18 to 24-year-olds doing so versus 19% for the over 65s. Overall, 90% of the youngest Britons get news online, compared to only 60% of the oldest Britons. So it's clear that the printed press is no longer the go-to medium for news.
An Instagram post by Gary Neville on a walk with Starmer reached over 2 million followers, with figures like that. Social media, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, has become the battleground for the election campaign. And if the Conservative Party is severely damaged tomorrow, will the papers that back them go down too? Well, we're very pleased to be joined now by David Yelland. David Yelland was editor of The Sun. He now is the sole owner, I believe, of Kitchen Table Partners, which offers sound PR advice. And he's the author of a podcast called When It Hits the Fan. I won't say it's our so-called rival, because actually it's a very good podcast.
We're going to begin by talking about The Sun, because just as we're about to release this podcast, The Sun, who until now have been strangely silent, has come out and backed Keir Starmer and Labour. Well, sort of backed. What's going on here?
So in newspaper terms, this is what we used to call stop press. Let's see. The Sun has, at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon before the election, mysteriously posted its leader online, and it is I don't know what you call it. It's a sort of slightly grudging editorial saying that they are in favour of a Starmer government. David Yelland, you're here. Can you imagine what's going on at The Sun, that they should do this extraordinary thing of suddenly posting a mid-afternoon editorial? Has that ever happened before? What's going on?
I think there's total chaos in Rupert Murdoch's London newspapers today. We can talk about Times in a minute, but at The Sun, this has come as a complete shock to most of the staff. And it's a non-endorsement, really. I mean, the front page, they're obviously embarrassed about it. So the front page, which they say they're going to stick with through all editions, doesn't mention Keir Starmer or the Labour Party. It's built around football with a picture of Gareth Southgate, and it says "Time for a new manager," and we don't mean sack Southgate. Well, that's funny, but this is a serious thing. And the editorial, which is not. You can't get it on the main Sun website, but you can get it if you search for it. You can find it. A little bit like the Sunday Times of the weekend. It's a bit like a sort of essay for a PPE paper. It goes round and round and round and round. But they don't give any. They point out all the problems that they have with Rishi, including immigration. We're going to hold him to account. What they're really saying here is he's going to win big, and we don't want to be completely irrelevant. That's really what they're saying, but because they don't actually say that, but that's really what this is about. And also, Alan, I think you'd be particularly interested. They mentioned press freedom very high up. That is about Leveson too. There are a lot of people, some people, very powerful people actually, in the Labour Party that think there should be a Leveson too. And I think that is a clearly aimed exocet missile across the bows.
We should just explain Leveson 2 is shorthand for the second part of the Leveson inquiry. The first part dealt with general press and ethics. The second part was going to look at criminal behaviour within companies. So that's not currently going ahead, but I know what you're saying is there are lots of newspaper executives who are worried that the Labour Party might go back to it. Lionel, what's your take?
Well, I want to pick up what David said about the Times, because they've also done something very unusual in their editorial. They've done an endorsement of Rishi Sunak's premiership, saying he may have made some missteps, but he's still striven to restore the party's reputation for competence and probity after the disasters of his predecessors, i.e. Truss and Boris Johnson. So this is a 2/3 page editorial which goes through meticulously what Sunak has achieved during his premiership, mentions staying strong on Ukraine, dealing with Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, and a few other, ban on smoking, which actually didn't happen, but not by his own design. So I think this is a sort of non-endorsement of the Conservative Party, but nothing on Keir Starmer or Labour. So I suspect that it'll be tomorrow. They may say I have something to say on Labour, but it would be a very grudging endorsement, and so late. This is what it tells you, that they're all over the place regarding allegiances, David. Tells you something about what will Rupert be making of this, Rupert Murdoch.
Well, he must have told them to do it. The Sun. That is the only. There's only one person on the Sun who could possibly be pro Keir Starmer, and that's the editor Victoria Newton. And I don't think she is particularly. She's not a particular political person who's come from a showbiz background. But everybody else, every other columnist, from Jane Moore to Trevor Kavanagh, everybody, Clarkson, have all pinned their own, colours to the mast. So she's not carrying the paper. The paper is not endorsing. I would also just say let's just watch the resignation honours list, assuming that Rishi Sunak loses. Just have a look at that, because this is their last chance.
If it was Rupert, David, the timing of these editorials is key. All the postal votes will already be in if you write an editorial in Times terms tomorrow morning, that's incredibly late. I mean, I think The Guardian came out last Saturday, the FT was on Monday. When would a Sun editorial, if Rupert had been at his prime, you'd have expected it, a couple of days before the vote itself?
A week away, really. A newspaper has to campaign. You don't just say, it's not an endorsement, it's a campaign. I mean, there's no single policy reason why they've done this. There's no sort of, it is cynical and quite laughable, actually, I think. I think it's embarrassing. I mean, it's very interesting. We've seen nothing from the Labour Party that I've seen. I don't know either of you have seen anything. When the Sun backed Labour, Tony Blair was quoted in that paper. I mean, in the day, it was greeted by the whole establishment, the Labour Party, as a turning point. And it's almost like, when you apologise, sorry, not sorry. It's an endorsement. It's not an endorsement. It's really, really strange. I've never seen anything quite like it. And I know that there is chaos at the time. I know Lionel's hinted at this, but at the times, which actually you would have thought be much more likely to back the Labour Party, what are they going to do? You've got an editor there that really doesn't want to back the Labour Party. A lot of staff that do. I mean, this is the biggest thing, isn't it? We are going to see the Conservative Party almost completely wiped out, I think, on Thursday, and the Labour Party getting the biggest majority in its history. It's inconceivable that the Sun can be the wrong side of that. So that's why they've had to do what they've had to do, but it won't be the Sun what won it.
And David, you talk about chaos just in terms of timing. This idea of rushing out a front page at 4:00 in the afternoon. I mean, what's going on?
Well, as I say, it's total chaos. I mean, what happens if something big happens now? A huge global news event. It won't be on the front page. I mean, it would just be on Twitter. It would have to be a big news event to take this off the front page. But I can't believe they're going to go with that front page to all editions. It's so weak.
Well, on that bombshell, and to use the old press technology, we can replate, start the presses again, and get on with the episode.
So we've had the Sunday Times with a lukewarm endorsement. The Times were speaking on Wednesday lunchtime, has said nothing at all that I've noticed.
Not the Thunderer.
It is far from thundered. It's not even whispering. It's had. I mean, the leader this morning was a sort of limp lettuce of a rumination on Rishi Sunak. Did that surprise you that the Times has not said anything?
No, it didn't surprise me. I have to say, I think some of the reporting in the Times has been superb. The Times is a very strange beast because it's a very good newspaper that seems where the staff almost defy their editor. They are good despite, not because of their editor. And there are some newspapers that are like that. So the Times, is not irrelevant. Post-election, we're going to see obviously a battle for the hearts and minds of the Conservative Party between Reform and the Tories. But what all these Tories forget, including those in the media, is that when you lose power, you are irrelevant. It will not matter. Suella Braverman from 10 p.m. on Thursday night when she's banging on about whatever she's banging on about, no one's going to be listening. And they've forgotten that. But Labour, of course, never forget that because they spend most of their lives in opposition.
But just explain how it used to work. You're the editor of The Sun. You've got the big man upstairs.
Yeah.
Does he tell you what to write?
No.
Who to back?
No.
How does it work?
It's all decided way before you're told what to do. Because if you're ever being told what to do, then you're probably about to be fired because you should never be in my case, I was, a left of the aisle liberal deputy editor of the New York Post is what I was doing. Tony Blair was elected and Rupert began to talk to me quite a lot about Tony Blair, who he adored at the time, as did I. That's a long time ago. Things can only get better and all that stuff. I still have a high regard for Tony Blair, actually. Not many people do, but I do. So, he knew when he appointed me, he didn't need to say, the paper had already endorsed Tony Blair the year before I got the job. I got the job a year after he was elected. So it wasn't necessary to have any of those discussions. I have to say, lots of things were different then. One of them was this: the Sun was full of quite serious comment about policy. In the first term or pre-first term, it was about peace in Northern Ireland. Really quite complex stuff. Sure Start, the NHS, their pledges for the NHS on waiting lists, quite modest ambitions compared to what we need now. Re-establishing Britain's role around the world, its relationship with the US. So Sun leaders were full of policy. There were sort of policy reasons why we backed Tony Blair. It wasn't just because we liked Tony Blair. It was because we thought that him being elected was in the interest of our readers. Now, that's one of the things I would just say about the terribly weak state of the Sun. At no point does the editor or the team seem to have thought about what is in the interest of their readers. Right, this country is on. Readers cannot get NHS appointments. The schools are underfunded. The water is not working. The country has broken down, and it is the job of a tabloid editor, all editors actually, to edit the paper in the interests of their readers, and they don't seem to care about the readers.
No, because they've been in decline for a long time. I mean, yes. The Sun around your era and Kelvin Mackenzie, they were selling 4.5 million copies.
3.8 in my time. Yeah.
Okay, not gone down since Kelvin.
Yeah,
He's
but big numbers.
Yeah, it was huge. Whereas today, was it?
We don't know. They don't.
So they're operating from a position of weakness. And I want to go back to something you said, David, where you thought that the era when Rupert Murdoch was essentially presiding over the system, that his influence really mattered when it came to the political choices at the top. I think that era has been over for some time. I don't think the tabloids have really mattered for 15 years.
I do think, and I said in our own podcast actually yesterday on the BBC, that the Daily Mail is really like a super tanker of negativity parked on the national lawn. That's what it is. And
with no water.
It leaks negatively into the entire system, and it still does that, and it will continue to do that. And my advice to Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench is to really ignore it. Your press team will have to look at what they do every day. Don't look at it till 11 a.m. Don't look at it at 7 a.m. Don't let it infect what you do. And this is a lot of people in business, as you know, Lionel, have the same view of the British press. People that run global businesses, they will not look at the British press in the same way as they look at the press around the world, because it can affect your joie de vivre. It can affect your, But your main point, Lionel, is correct, which is has been an element of Emperor's New Clothes about all this for a long time. The Sun now is a complete irrelevance, really.
So, David, put your old editor hat on and rate the FT editorial and the Sunday Times editorial. I think the words PPE.
Yeah, I mean, I and The Economist, actually. I mean, I sat down and read them this morning before coming here, and they are like essays. The Sunday Times, in particular, actually is a very weak endorsement. It's like, on the one hand, this has happened. On the one hand, that has happened. It's very nice about Rishi. It's extremely nice about Jeremy Hunt. It's not so nice about George Osborne and David Cameron, but it sort of says about Hunt and Rishi that they're good public servants, which I think in many ways they are. But it doesn't really make the case for why it's backing the Labour Party. It's almost like it's their turn. There is no alternative to use that sort of Thatcher phrase. The Economist is a and the FT. There's much more substance there. Planning is, the thing which and a move towards the EU. And I think those two things are the right reasons.
So again, if you could just explain that. Sort of elaborate courtship that goes on between the newspapers and the parties. I mean, Labour has been cultivating the FT for quite some time. Rachel Reeves has had a lot of contact. Yes. I mean, again, does it matter, or is it really not so much buying an endorsement, but it's an insurance policy. It's a sort of protection against attack.
Stating the obvious, you would know, Lionel, a lot more about how the FT deals with the political class than I would. But certainly in my experience, you can't really run anything in this country, or really in Europe or America, without understanding the FT and having friends at the FT. It's not that you want the FT's endorsement. It's just that the FT lives in that. It lives in the elite part of the world. And certainly, if you think about Corbyn's time, he had people who would have been unable to get through a lunch with Henry Mance. Let's just that's taking one FT journalist just out. I always say to people, if you can't spend half an hour with the editor of the FT on your own, without an army of PR people, and talk about the state of the world, then you're in the wrong job.
Yeah, just for the record, Jeremy Corbyn actually never visited us for lunch during the election, before the election. I think he probably understood that we were never going to back him, but it was interesting that he didn't actually sit down, unlike Ed Miliband. Tony Blair was always there, Gordon Brown, etc. And of course, the FT did back Neil Kinnock in 1992, very controversially. That was a wandering editorial, but it caused a lot of angst within the paper and outside. And then in 1997, it was a full-throated endorsement of Tony Blair.
There are two particular papers I'd love to hear your views on, David. Let's start with the Daily Mail. Now, the Daily Mail, to me, whatever its politics, always had the feeling of having its finger on the pulse of Middle England. And I was astonished by its behaviour towards Boris Johnson. Here's a man that was, the words lies, corruption, cronyism, chaos, partying, bankrupt ethics. Everything that the Daily Mail would hate normally in any politician. And yet, apart from a brief interlude where Geordie Gregg was there, it has wholeheartedly 100% gone for Johnson, gone for Truss, gone for Rishi Sunak. It seems to have just
and Theresa May.
And Theresa May. It seems my party, right or wrong, that's a very different way of editing from a newspaper from trying to sense where its readers are. So it feels most that something has changed with the Mail.
Well, there is one word that you haven't mentioned which explains all of that, and that is Brexit. Brexit has completely changed everything, and it has, of course, it's a tribal divide down the middle of the country, but for whatever reason, it was impossible, is impossible, or has been impossible for a number of years, if you are a Remainer, to get a job on a number of these newspapers. That applies to the Telegraph, to the Sun. I'm not saying everybody on those papers is, but if they are, Remainers, they keep pretty quiet about it, and they wouldn't be public about it. So that has distorted absolutely everything and produced a tribal culture on those newspapers, a sort of prism through which they see everything. And as a result of that, they made a series of terrible mistakes.
I think that's probably right, but in terms of journalism, it's an astonishing thing that what you're saying is that political ideology has now trumped any kind of sense of journalistic basics.
It's
ethics.
Destroyed them. That's what it's done.
Yeah.
It's consumed them. Many of them as individuals, actually, and as newspapers. It's destroyed them. They've gone mad. I may. You're going to think Yelland's gone completely bananas. Have a look at the Telegraph. Look at some of the.
Let's read, because I've been enjoying. You've been tweeting them. So there's my favourite, Alistair Heath. Armageddon is upon us, and Britain will never be the same again. Tim Stanley. Keir Starmer is about to suck the last remaining joy out of Britain. Tim Stanley. Again, brace yourself for Sir Keir's war on joy. Derangement and disaffection are sweeping away the old democratic era. That's Janet Alamy. You've sort of more or less in your tweets, you've suggested that here is a generation of journalists who are either going to have to be swept away.
I had the great privilege of coming up in the Sun under Calvin Mackenzie, who was a great editor. He obviously has huge faults, but he was one of the great tabloid editors. And he used to shout, "Nurse!" Like if somebody had, you'd be in the newsroom and he'd shout, "Nurse!" Because somebody had gone a bit bananas. And I often think, really, I sometimes I tweet "nurse" and I think, actually, only a few people understand what I'm talking about. But these people need to be marched off the national stage. They have let down their readers. They have it's like a headmaster. You've let themselves down. And I'm not joking, I mean, it is, Brexit was only 52-48, and it would not have happened without these newspapers. And of course, the challenge that Keir Starmer has, and Rachel Reeves have now is, the country must move towards its biggest market. It's to say that that's controversial is just there will have to be, and that's in some of the things that are going to be necessary. These people will have to be ignored.
So are you saying the same thing as, this is a different subject for a different program, but the mailisation of the British press with all these former acolytes of Paul Dacre's now sort of spread out editing all these papers. They're all in senior positions, including the Times and the Telegraph. But are you saying the Telegraph has suffered the same syndrome that you're saying has happened at the Mail, where ideology is now completely trumping the normal journalistic instincts that would have been there 20 years ago?
Yes, absolutely. And the one thing they have all achieved is Brexit. I don't want to go on and on about Brexit, but I think sometimes we need to do that because it is such an important. It has affected everything, and what we're going to see when you see Vox Pops on the BBC or whoever of people saying they've given up on politics, that's because of Brexit, because they were promised something that they haven't got. That's why people, vulnerable people, up in Grimsby and all these other places where the Tories tend to go on the away days. Places, by the way, where I grew up. They go up there, tell the people we're going to do this, and then piss off and not actually, do anything. So of course people have always been cynical about politicians, but Brexit's made it a lot worse. And then there are these other pillars of the right, which I was just talking about, which are the culture wars, net zero, and immigration. Those three things are the things that the tabloids will come at Starmer on from day one, and those are the three things that will decide who takes over the right. But as I already said in this conversation once already, what the Conservative side, including the editor class that support them, forget is that when you lose power, you become irrelevant.
This is Media Confidential from Prospect Magazine, and after the break, we'll have more on the media's role in this election campaign. We'll be right back.
In the Prospect podcast this week, Emily Lawford talks to the legendary pollster Peter Kellner just a few hours ahead of the general election result to try and work out if the polls have shifted in any way. Emily is then joined by Tom Clark, one of the contributing editors here at Prospect Magazine, to ask what challenges could trip up a new PM in the first weeks of the government. So follow the Prospect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And right now we've got a rather amazing election offer, 6 months of digital access to Prospect for only £15, which by my calculation would buy you 4 cappuccinos, depending on whether you buy them in Clapham or Westminster. And that gets you all of our pre-election updates and post-election analysis. So type prospectmagazine.co.uk into your web browser and click the subscribe button now to get unbiased coverage for only £2.50 a month for the next 6 months.
Welcome back to Media Confidential. And now more from David Yelland and flirting with Nigel Farage. So David, there's not a cigarette paper's difference between your views on Brexit and mine. I think it was an act of grave self-harm. The FT was absolutely against it. But when you say that people feel let down because the benefits that they were promised did not materialise and they became cynical, the counter-argument, which I certainly took seriously after the result, it was quite close, 52-48. But if you'd tried to rerun the referendum, that would have made people even more cynical. I mean, don't you think?
No, you are right. And the fact is that the economic, the system has not worked for most people for a long time, both here and in the US. And that's why we've got Trump, and that's why we had Brexit. So the system wasn't working. It was working for the elites, but it wasn't working
So
for
I just
everybody else.
wish that the papers did a better job on, for example, covering immigration. I mean, these numbers are even higher now, people coming in who are non-EU, by the way. I mean, higher than the EU immigration that we had. But then the second piece of the argument, which is not investigated at all, is, well, why? Because the British economy needs immigrant workers, but nobody wants to, or very few people want to admit that. The newspapers, the news media, even the BBC is not really addressing that at all.
No, I thought
Ed Conway at Sky is very good.
Yeah, I thought Michelle Hussein's interview with Farage, the first one on the Today programme, was very good on that issue, where she went through which workers would you allow in. She got to butchers, and he said this is ridiculous, and she said isn't that the point? You're right. I mean, funny enough, I forget which of the three leaders. I think it may have been the FT leader. Yes, it had a graphic of GDP per head and how it's fallen off in the last 3 or 4 years, and that, of course, is why people are angry, and that's what the system has stopped working for most people, and therefore in that situation it's very easy to get to win votes by blaming immigrants or whoever it is for that decline in life chances, which is what.
Can I just test what you mean by you say a whole swathe of people who have been relevant up to now are about to be irrelevant? That's obviously true of a lot of Tory politicians. But the idea of a newspaper, as it were, in opposition is quite an interesting one. As the Guardian would, under Thatcher, I think, had its highest circulation in print terms. New York Times under Trump. If you were editing a tabloid under Starmer and you were not aligned with his policies, what role would you have, and what sort of things would you be going for?
Well, you either become part of the regime, really, which is what the Sun did in a way. I mean, the Sun was very, we had this the most dangerous man in Britain, and we were basically Blairite, or you become the opposition. And either way, for a great tabloid, either of those two stances is great fun, and because fun is what you're supposed to be doing, because these are tabloid newspapers. What the current crop, they've got a very aging readership. And first of all, the readership is diminished so much that they're almost irrelevant anyway. If you take the Express as a case study, you've got an average age of over 70.
Big online readership.
I can't remember the last time anybody seriously mentioned anything that was in that newspaper, or the Sun for that matter. The Mail is different. The Mail is culturally a very important part of our country, and will continue to be. But it's not as important as it thinks it is. It's brilliant at projecting itself into the centre of our national debate. I sometimes think we might make the mistake of talking about it too much, because generationally, of course, anybody below the age of probably 50, certainly 40, but probably 50, is simply not looking at the Daily Mail. It's completely irrelevant, I know that the Mail has a big online following, but that's a global online, mostly showbiz and sport led. They're not looking at comment. They're not influenced. The Mail is not influencing that generation politically.
Where do you sense reform? I mean, there's going to be a bloodbath on the right somehow or other after this election. Yeah. Reform's going to be there. Farage is going to be there. How do you see that playing out in what we used to call the Tory press? Are they going to have a flirtation, a love affair with reform?
Of all the politicians out there right now, the one that is most popular amongst the editor class is Nigel Farage. They love him. I'm sure that doesn't apply to the FT, but for most editors, political editors.
I won't speak for the FT, but I think you made a good bet there, David.
I'm amazed how many people refer to Nigel as Nigel.
Yeah, what is it about Nigel and Boris?
Yeah, it's. I'm very friendly with Michael Crick, who I think is a very great journalist, and he wrote this wonderful book about Nigel Farage. I recommend it to everybody. It's typical Crick. It's absolutely in the detail. The real story of Farage is not what you think. I don't think that's going into huge detail. All these stories we've seen in the last few days about racists, being associated with reform. I think my view, the way I'll look at this, try and take a helicopter view, is why is it that so many racists are attracted to this party? I don't think it's a coincidence. I do think that a lot of my peer group have danced with the devil quite a lot on the right, and I think it's very, very worrying.
But will the papers, to repeat Alan's question, will they be dancing with the devil once Keir Starmer comes in with the new Labour government? Are they going to flirt? Yeah,
they are. Are they going to flirt with reform is the question. Yes, they are.
Flirt with Farage.
They already are doing. I mean, if you look at The Sun, I'm a bit of an anorak, and I do look at The Sun every day, obviously. It is far more pro-reform than it is pro-conservative. If you look at the amount of coverage, two things. Look how much coverage they give, look at the lack of questions they ask, and look how many times you see a senior Sun journalist in a frame, a picture frame, with Nigel Farage. If Trevor Kavanagh, believe it or not, or George Pascoe Watson interviewed Tony Blair, there would always be, here I am with Tony Blair. Very odd, actually, but that's a very British thing. They don't do that so much now with the Tories, but they do it with reform.
We talked about the waning influence directly in a sort of B2C, the consumer influence. The influence on the BBC and the broadcasters is still there, isn't it? Because it's very difficult for the BBC not to read the front pages and the editorials and feel they have to reflect them somehow in their coverage. Do you think that's still true, and is that still going to hold true under Labour?
Yes, it is still very true. In fact, it's become truer because the institutionalised reviewing of the nightly news front pages on Sky, GB News, BBC, everywhere really, has become part of our media culture. The agenda, the weather, is set by the front pages, particularly the Daily Mail. And I'm often quite surprised. I'll get a call, at 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock on an evening from a junior person at the Today programme, and I'll be told, can you come on and talk about this because the Daily Mail has said this? At which point I say, why is it relevant that the Daily Mail have said that? But what the Daily Mail have said has set the Today not the editor, but the junior members of the team, it's full of them with energy that this is going to happen or that's going to happen. They go, no, it's not. It's not going to happen. So what we need to do is somehow break down that addiction. I'm as guilty of it as anybody. I still look at the front pages.
Where's the influence shifting when you talk to your clients? Social media, the general consensus seems to be is retreating from news. What are your clients frightened of now if it's less so the
Well, most people in business are global. They're doing business all over the world. So Britain's only a small part of it, and they look at the British media with quite a jaundiced view. I mean, it's quite what is going on here. The media culture here is a peculiar type. Funnily enough, social media has amplified the power of the tabloids in many ways. Certainly the front pages. If until people like Nick Clegg went to work for Facebook Meta, the press operation over at Facebook would often massively overreact to a Daily Mail front page. Because if you're in America, particularly in California, where there are no newspapers really, when you see the front of the Daily Mail attacking Facebook, say on child protection issue, it looks like the end of the world. You think, Jesus Christ, what's going on? They have no context to put. I was a partner at a PR firm called Brunswick who worked for Facebook. We went in there and explained to them that actually it does look pretty bad, but in the British, it needs to be put in context. But that's just one small example, and there are many others.
So, David, just thinking ahead, Labour government this week, probably a pretty big majority. You had one piece of advice to Keir Starmer, which is don't read the Daily Mail, at least in front page until 11 o'clock. What's your other one piece of advice for the next Labour government?
First 100 days. I think they need to set some targets and hit them
for the media,
for the country. Yeah.
But for handling the media,
I would not put media relations as in the top 3 things that you need to worry about.
So, Alan, that was a fascinating conversation with a veteran of the tabloid wars back in the 1990s. And what he said about Brexit really struck me. It's fractured the Conservative Party, it's fractured the country, and it's essentially consumed the tabloids, consigned them to an early grave, with the exception of the Daily Mail.
I think it's more deforming than that, if I can put it like that, in terms of what he's saying about ideology trumping journalism. I mean, when Brexit happened, I was out of journalism. I was running an Oxford college, and I knew what I wanted from the media. I thought this is going to be the most consequential decision of our lifetimes. And I wanted people to give me the facts on both sides before I voted. And a secondary thing was if somebody wanted to tell me what they thought. But I wanted to be armed with the facts. And 2/3 of the British press, I would say, did exactly the opposite. They began by saying, this is what we think. We're not going to give you the facts on both sides. And then we're going to tell you what we think again. And it was a huge failure of journalism, I think. And I think what David was telling us today is that failure continues to this day, where a generation of journalists has grown up for whom ideology is the thing, and the secondary aspects of simply fairly informing readers about the facts has become almost a sideshow. If that's so, that's really significant.
That's all from Media Confidential today. Thank you, David Yelland, for joining us today. We'll be back next week with more news from behind the headlines and clickbait.
And it could feel like a transformed country. Who knows? You can send any questions or comments to mediaconfidential@prospectmagazine.co.uk or get in touch on X, formerly Twitter, where we are at MediaConfPod. And remember to follow Media Confidential wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening to Media Confidential, brought to you by Prospect Magazine and Fresh Air. Our producer is Martin Points Roberts.